on the East Coast. It's 1 o'clock here on the East Coast of the United States. We're doing this on a Wednesday rather than a usual Friday, and I'm really pleased that we're able to be joined by Zaki Ahmed, who is a veteran South African political activist and a leading authority on the anti-apartheid movement, and Mazen Kumsia, who is a founder and volunteer director of the Palestinian Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University and the author of Popular Resistance in Palestine: A History, Hope, and Empowerment. And we're going to talk about the history of boycotts in both South African history and in Palestinian history. I hope that folks will put questions in the chat, regardless of what perspective you're coming from. Please offer up questions, and then after the initial conversations, I'll go to some of those questions and I'll convey them to our guests. So Zaki, let me start with you. Can you talk a little bit about the role of boycotts in the anti-apartheid movement? Where did these ideas of having calling for international boycotts emerge from? And what were, when it came to, there was culture, there was sports, there was academia, what were some of the internal debates and dilemmas that you faced around this question of international boycotts of South Africa during apartheid?
Peter, it's finally good to chat to you. I always find you a little bit too serious on social media. But let me start by saying perhaps I want to start at a different space, and that is to look at the role of boycotts internally as part of the liberation movement inside, and then address the question of international boycotts.
Great.
So if I can start off just on some abstract questions.
Yeah.
There are three elements to a boycott. One is the boycott as a principle. The second is boycott as part of a broader strategy. And when you have that strategy, what tactic do you use when boycotting? So from our side, the question, perhaps to start, of boycotting the apartheid state and all its institutions, that was a question of principle. Then boycott formed a much broader part of the liberation movement's struggle as part of its strategy and tactics. So to give you an example, in 1952, when the apartheid state introduced the Bantu Education Act, the ANC called a boycott of government schools and took kids out of the school. And they intended keeping alternate schools open. But two reasons. Because the state was broadening the number of children in school, even though it was going to give kids apartheid education, more people clamored for school. And because the missionaries were providing education before that, they only ever reached a minority of children. And as a consequence, the ANC and the Communist Party trying to keep the schools open, the ANC schools open for as long as possible, that boycott didn't succeed. It didn't succeed in winning the end of Bantu education, and it didn't win in terms of changing the government strategy as to what the content of education was going to be. So as a strategy and tactic, that failed. But we all knew that, very broadly speaking, the tactic of boycott was going to work as part of a strategy of a liberation movement. We also knew that we're not touching any apartheid state institution to debate with an apartheid apologist or to debate with a member of government or so on. What then happens is, for instance, the Alexandra bus boycott, which was boycotting a bus company owned by the state when it raised fares in a time of great inflation and so on. That succeeded, and it succeeded for several reasons. That people would walk in the rain for 10 kilometers rather than take the bus, and it became part of a political struggle and was organized by the ANC. Now, that worked both because of the action of the mass of people, but also because business had an interest in getting workers to work rather than getting them there tired and then leaving again. So that is boycott as a tactic that worked. Come 1976 and 1980, I became politically active in 1976. And when we started boycotting schools, many of us, including me, especially me, was someone who believed that we should boycott until the end of apartheid, until Liberation Day, we should boycott. And of course, that was a very foolish idea. I tried to burn my school down. All that happened, I ended up in prison with one or two other kids, and then 150 of us were arrested for burning our schools. We couldn't boycott school forever. That would have been a mistake. It was a tactic. In 1980, in a schools boycott that I helped organize, we occupied schools and organized alternative classes, and then at the appropriate point, returned to school. Now, that is how boycotts worked internally. There were also things like bus boycotts, consumer boycotts, and so on. Moving outside, as you would know, boycott really became part of the international community's response, particularly India at the United Nations since about 46, when the Indian government, before its independence, already called for people to boycott South Africa. The boycott movement took off in two instances. The Sharpeville massacre as a response to what was happening internally. And then
That was in 1961, right?
that was 1961. And then the second time when it was reinforced on a mass scale was in 1976. In the interregnum, there was hardly any action on the boycott because there was no movement internally. Now, for me, the Duns workers' strike remains one of the best moments of the anti-apartheid movement. So that was boycotting South African goods when some young Irish workers refused to sell grapefruit. I can't remember exactly what it was, and just spontaneously organized themselves. And that gave rise to a lot of people understanding what needed to be done. In the international, so that is people boycotting. Then you had what institutions did, like academic institutions and so on, but also the international bodies. So apartheid was declared a crime against humanity. The 21st of March, which was Sharpeville Day, became the International Day Against Racism and so on, and the International Day Against Apartheid. Now, at that point, the only government in Europe that really supported, in Western Europe, that really supported the boycott was Sweden. And there were large anti-apartheid movements in Sweden, Netherlands, Britain, and later Australia, and so on, New Zealand. And finally, in the United States, where it moved beyond the African American, the Black community, into the broader white community, white progressive community in the United States. So from that point of view, the boycott had several elements. There was the arms embargo and the oil embargo. So around 1973, the Arab states imposed an oil embargo on South Africa. Of course, we got, with the Saudis, you can never trust them. We got oil anyway. So there was the oil embargo. There was the arms embargo, which not many countries followed. So Britain, the United States, Germany, West Germany at that time, didn't support the arms boycott, so certain arms got in. The French helped with nuclear. Israel was at the backbone of the nuclear support for the South African state, for nuclear stations, and preparing for a bomb. Now, the next set of boycotts that were fairly easy to organize was the academic boycotts and the cultural boycotts. Those boycotts were hardly ever broken. The only time I can think that it was broken was when Jimmy Cliff came to South Africa, Simon and Garfunkel with their Graceland tour, and Freddie Mercury, sadly, how could he do that? Come to Sun City to play, right? So those three, of course, I felt like going to the Freddie Mercury concert, but I couldn't, right? So the last element of the boycott, I think, um, that's important to remember is the financial institutions. Now, what shocks me about Israel is no one has gone after Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and those institutions who are funding Israel's current debt and at very low interest rates and so on. So, but those the financial sanctions really took off after after during the 1980s, and particularly when the United States, when Reagan's vetoes were over, what you call it when you,
Overturned, right?
yeah, Reagan's vetoes were overturned. So the principal part of the boycott, the principal part of the boycott was that everyone was agreed that no one will address the apartheid state and engage its apologists, its members, and so on at any level, not from South Africa and not externally. The second question is the academic boycott, for instance, was part of that. So no one came to speak, and no South African academic who was linked to an institution. There was no institutional links at all.
Mhm.
And people stayed off campus. And there was a chap called Connor Cruz O'Brien who
Yes,
came to
sure.
do the academic freedom lecture.
Mhm.
And there was a huge outcry,
Mhm.
primarily because as a liberal institution,
Mhm.
the belief was that they were not following their own values. And
Mhm.
so that was disrupted. There was a huge outcry and so on. So
Zaki,
I'm
I
giving,
want to turn to Mazen, so maybe we could just close it
yeah, I'm just
quickly.
a
Yeah.
little bit confused
Yeah.
and going on too much. I perorate.
No, no, this is very, very helpful as a kind of backdrop to understanding all the different kinds of boycotts during apartheid. Mazen, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the role of boycotts in Palestinian history and where they've been significant and how Palestinian political activists and leaders have thought about them historically before the BDS movement.
Uh, well, the BDS movement actually is contemporaneous with the Zionist movement. Basically, in 1880, for example, when we had our first uprising, that included a boycott of the colonial settlements of Petah Tikva and Rishon LeZion, and that was the first uprising, which was 145 years ago today. So this has always been part of the Palestinian struggle, is an attempt to talk about boycotts. I do want to tell you a very quick story also, since you mentioned. Zaki, that you got involved in 1970s. I got involved actually first in the struggle more actively than I was before in 1980 when I was elected president of the International Student Association at the University of Connecticut. I kind of ran because I thought it was a good way to meet girls. I was totally ignorant graduate student. Anyway, and I was surprisingly elected. So this Nigerian guy comes to me and he says, "Congratulations, Mazen. You're now our president for the International Student Association. So what are you going to do about South Africa?" And I said, "What's wrong with South Africa?" This is how naive I was in 1980. I was young, what can you say? So, anyways, he educated me, and we ended up bringing a speaker who many years later I found out was actually an ANC member from London. He came to Connecticut, spoke to us. And so I got introduced into boycotts actually for South Africa before I got introduced to boycotts for Palestine, and I became active on the issue of South Africa first, surprisingly, maybe for some of you. But anyway, in the 1980s, especially after the uprising of 1988, we became much more involved with issues of boycott, divestment, sanctions, things like that. And in the 1990s, I led basically while in the U.S. I was in the U.S. at the time. I became involved in issues of boycott, especially in academia, because I was in academia, and I found it to be a very effective tool. Not necessarily, just like with South Africa, was a moral uh, issue, and it was also an issue of public relations more than an issue of economic impact on South Africa that we had in the 1980s. For example, even when companies withdrew from South Africa, South Africa was still able to get a lot of computers, for example, and things
Mhm.
like that. So it was more, an issue of morality and an issue of that the South Africans and the same with the Israelis who used to go to Western countries and be welcomed with open arms as basically fellow Democrats. The only democracy in Africa, as they used to say, and the only democracy in the Middle East, as they say now, they still say it. Even though Israel, as you know, is an apartheid, racist, and genocidal regime. But anyways, it opens up venues for discussion for us more than anything else, and it allowed us in the 1980s and 1990s to grow rapidly as a movement, uh, precisely because of the BDS movement. In other words, when you tell people you're boycotting Israeli academics and Israeli artists, they say, wait a minute, why are you doing that? So it gives you a chance to explain what is going on the ground, the system of apartheid, the laws that segregate, etc. So this was a very useful tool for us, and it mushroomed, began to really grow in the 1990s. And then we had the petition for academic and cultural boycott in the 1990s, which I managed alone to gather a couple of thousand signatures on it from academics in the US and in Western Europe, and many others collected many more signatures. So it was very important. Then came the year 2000, 2005, which was uprising number 13, if you want. And this uprising even mobilized people more than the uprising of 1988 to 1991. Sort of like South Africa had a number of uprisings, Soweto uprising and the ones that preceded it. But anyways, that uprising, what you see with the BDS is that it grows during uprisings, during issues like what is happening now for the past 25 months, which is the onslaught on Gaza and the acceleration of the Zionist genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. The BDS movement grew even more rapidly, and it grows at every uprising, of course. So it's important. The call, perhaps, that you are thinking about when you mentioned the beginning of BDS, probably you're thinking about the year 2005,
Yes.
when we had many organizations in Palestine formally adopt BDS as a strategy and as a tactic to achieve liberation. In 2005, we issued the Kairos document also. No, the Kairos document 2008. But anyway, the call to BDS is 2005. And it was modeled a lot about what happened in South Africa. Even some of the language mimicked it. Then came 3 years later or so, the Kairos document, which 2008, which called on it was signed mostly by, all by the Christian communities in Palestine. All the denominations signed on to it, similar to the Kairos document from South Africa. which says to churches around the world and communities around the world, hey, if you hold moral principles and you want a nonviolent way to arrive at peace, we are offering you here a direction. The direction is BDS, and here's why, and here's what we are asking. And it was both for Kairos and for the 2005 document, that's 20 years ago now, both had the same principles, which is based on international law. One is the right of refugees to return, ending Israeli occupation of Palestinian Arab lands, including the Golan Heights, of course, and equality, full equality for people here, regardless of their religion or background. This is what is demanded. Both documents do not talk about one state, two state, or any such things, political things. They talk about strictly about human rights. And that's why I also ended up writing a book called Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment, where I lay out these tactics and strategies for liberation that are based on popular struggle. This is kind of a quick background
Yeah.
with obvious bias to my own activism, but
Um, th Thank you. It's also a very helpful opening. Zaki, I wanted to ask you a little bit if you could talk about debates about the academic boycott in South Africa during apartheid. What about people who said, um, you know, that these universities were comparatively liberal, by South African context, that they had people at places like University of Cape Town or Wits or University of Western Cape who were actually, involved in opposing apartheid? And was it fair for those people to be boycotted? Or what about the fact that some of the universities might have had black students who could have then been hurt by these boycotts? How did you, and then the principle of academic freedom, what were the internal conversations like around these questions?
I think there needs to be a discussion about absolutism when you use a boycott as a strategy and as a tactic. And I think academic institutions is one such institution because it's relatively autonomous from the state.
Mhm.
Now, in South Africa, there's a slight difference compared to, say, Israel. The universities you mentioned, UCT and Wits University, and to a lesser extent, the University of Natal and Rhodes University. What those universities had is they had a core of white liberals,
Mhm.
but then they also had a core of Marxists.
Mhm.
And the Marxist scholars, particularly the historians and sociologists, played a very important role in popularizing ideas of what was happening in the economy, what was happening in society, and above all, what happened in our history. And the critical thing there is those academics had very close relations to the ANC, or were in fact members of the ANC or the Communist Party, but mostly they were independent left Marxists. And at the School of Oriental and African Studies and the Institute for Commonwealth Studies in Britain, you had someone like Professor Shula Marx, who was one of the most amazing historians and really set Southern African history and African history back on the map in a way that was anti-colonial and anti-apartheid. And so the relationship between her and the ANC, of which she was a member, was to ensure that certain academics could come to Britain and vice versa. Some come to South Africa. That was very different to the apartheid states, Stellenbosch University, Potchefstroom, and so on, and the Bantustan universities, for which there was absolutely no contact with them, because they were real instruments of apartheid, not a situation where there was a contestation about academic freedom. Of course, at Wits and UCT and so on, you had academics who supported apartheid. They wouldn't say so, but they certainly did. But you could smell them.
Mhm. Mhm.
so the debates were not that difficult. I think in Israel the situation is slightly different today because they've become instruments of the military, industrial, and surveillance complex as much as apart from the individual academics there, some of the individual academics who should not be boycotted that are part of a commitment to liberation of the people in Palestine and a constitutional democracy in Israel. I think the importance of those people to solidarity with those people is important. But I do think the mistake you made is one that we should all learn from, not condemn people who make mistakes. I think that is rather foolish. For me, the question is, any institution in Israel today, academic institution, is one that we should not visit. It is better to get a hall hired. If there's students who want to listen to you, they are going to come out of the campus to listen to you.
Right.
So the academic boycott was serious. It didn't, in a sense, Black students were harmed by basic education, by primary school and high school already. The few of us, and I didn't finish university until after apartheid or so on. I didn't finish high school. So the importance for us is that the engagement with South Africa, the difference between South Africa and Israel is too stark. Is way too stark, and I think it would be important to find a way to reach Israeli academics and Palestinian academics who support national liberation and a constitutional democracy in Israel.
So the point you're making is that the South African universities, or at least some of them, were not actually as tied into the military-industrial complex as they are in Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, the apartheid, the WITS and UCT became sanctuaries for leftist academics and for white students and white young people who opposed conscription
into the military. Mazen, can I ask you a version of the same question about how you have thought and the conversations that you've been part of are on the question of academic boycott around people who say, well, what about the Palestinian students who go to Israeli universities, for instance, or Palestinian academics who teach there? Are they being harmed by this? Or for that matter, the Jewish Israeli academics who may genuinely be opposed to occupation and apartheid. How have you thought about that and with your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, BDS, I put the link to the BDSmovement.net website, has some of the discussions about these things. But briefly, I mean, I can say Israeli academia as a whole, institution-wide, are complicit in the occupation. There's not a single university within the regime that opposes apartheid or that opposes the idea of Israel as a Jewish state sans Palestinians. So most of them are built on stolen land, actually, even Tel Aviv University. So it's hard to say anything positive about any Israeli institution of higher education. That's not the same as Israeli academics, of course. You have people like Ilan Pappé and Tom Segev and others who wrote books and articles exposing the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, and so on. Some of them lost jobs as a result of this, like Ilan Pappé from Haifa University. But anyway, the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott campaign, which I'll get you the link to in a few minutes also, discriminates between boycotting institutions and boycotting individuals. We are not against, for example, me sitting with some Israeli academics and talking or doing something positive, especially if they join us in the struggle. Actually, I was arrested more than a dozen times, detained, etc., And half the times I was arrested with Israelis who are with me, standing in front of a olive tree about to be uprooted or a home about to be demolished. So certainly I was not boycotting these Israelis, but I cannot, for example, collaborate with a scientist at an Israeli university and co-publish a paper, because if we co-publish a paper, he has to put the institution, let's say Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University or something like that, which makes it obvious. There's a difference, in other words, between normalization and joint struggle. Joint struggle is when Israelis and Palestinians join hand to reject the ideas of supremacy, chosenness, racism, apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and work together on this. Versus normalization, when and this happens all the time in all settings of systems like ours, whether it's South Africa or even in the Americas. When the European colonizers arrived, there were Native Americans who normalized and were willing even to be guides in the American military to find their fellow compatriots and kill them and so forth. But Indian tribe chiefs, indigenous people, First Nations in the U.S., leaders who are principled were not against talking and trying to understand and trying to connect. And especially when there were white Europeans who were willing to actually join them in the struggle for their rights. So this is the same here. We are more than happy to join struggle with any Israeli Jew, Orthodox, secular, whatever, who is willing to stand with us for human rights. If they support Zionism and racism, then of course we cannot work with them. If they insist on being institutional and that they have to normalize and then they use this mostly for propaganda purposes, saying, hey, look, there are Israeli students, Palestinian students going to the same university. So what are you complaining about, And so I think we need to be aware of what's going on and what is the nature of the system that's in the Israeli universities. For example, the Palestinians represent now within Israeli society those who have Israeli blue cards. I have the green card, which is the card of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is a green card. The blue card is the one that people inside the green line, like from the Galilee, etc., have. Those with the blue card represent about 20% of the Israeli public. Okay, what percentage of tenured faculty do they represent? The answer is less than 1% of Israeli tenured professors, let alone department chairs or presidents of universities or whatever, deans of faculties. So there is huge discrimination still existing within the Israeli academic, and it has nothing to do, by the way, with quality. We see that obviously in the issue of the doctors, because Palestinian doctors, you cannot do that with Palestinian doctors. So if you look at Israeli hospitals, you find that the percentage of Palestinians, doctors and surgeons and so forth, is proportional to the other doctors. But in academia, this is not the same. So that's why academics has a racism problem. And when they get rid of people like Ilan Pape, because one of his students ended up writing a paper later proven to be completely accurate, graduate supposedly with great honors and good grades, and then they withdraw his master degree simply because he exposed the massacre of Tantura in 1948 from the University of Haifa. And the University of Haifa is one of the more liberal, if you want, universities in Israel.
Yeah. Listen, one of the questions, we have a couple of questions in the chat about the BDS movement's condemnation or criticism of the group standing together. Standing together is a group that brings of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens. And I think there were many people in the US, including myself, who thought that they seemed to be trying to work in support of a position of equality, of between Palestinians and Israelis, not to say that everything is fine now, but to actually try to oppose this system of supremacy in the name of equality. And also they were opposing the genocide in Gaza. So I'm just curious how you think about that organization and BDS's criticism of it.
I don't know that particular organization, but I do have a litmus test for any Israeli organization. And I am willing to work with organizations themselves to be truly for rights. And I begin and end even with the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands. If an Israeli organization like Zochrot, for example, is willing to state that unequivocally on their website and support it, then I say I have no problem sitting with Zochrot and even writing a paper with Zochrot. If an Israeli university comes up and says, I support the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands and be treated in fully equality in the society. So far, I haven't seen such academic university or institution within the Israeli system. So that's my litmus test of organizations, and you can ask that organization if they do that. If it's public on their website, then I'm happy to work with them. If it's not, then I consider them a Zionist organization that there is what's called liberal Zionists, which to me is an oxymoron, or left-wing Zionism, which says, hey, 2 states for 2 people and the occupation, blah, blah, blah. But they're against equality. They're still for supremacy, even if they coach it in some issues of rights.
Yeah. Zaki, I wanted to go to you back on the South Africa case. When you look back at the anti-apartheid movement and you think about what played the most important role in ultimately in the regime falling in the early 1990s, do you have a thought about what parts of boycotts, if any, played the most significant role?
Well, the most important factor that led to our liberation were the mass movements, and that was particularly the trade union movement, and with it the youth and civic organizations and churches within the country. The ANC in exile played some role, but not that much. They played a much more important role on the international scale in relation to boycott and sanctions and divestment and so on. No white South African felt happy going abroad. Even radical white South Africans did not feel welcome. When it became clear that they weren't racist, they weren't state supporters, of course they were welcomed. But for me, the most important part of the international boycott was the fact that white South Africans who supported apartheid felt unwelcome everywhere. One of the differences that we have with Palestine is there were never Afrikaner supporters in every country, like the Zionist movement has, and the Jewish diaspora. So there wasn't that. Even though there were white supremacist groups, they didn't mean at that time they weren't important. They couldn't must 10 people to support apartheid. So the anti-apartheid movement was a critical part in isolating the apartheid state and making people feel unwelcome. And from my point of view, what
Yeah.
really pissed off white South Africa was the fact that they couldn't play rugby.
Absolutely.
The sports
Absolutely.
boycott. The sports boycott. And I would urge people abroad, make sure that Israel doesn't get into sports at all.
I don't think
Disrupt the sport.
Israelis are sports obsessed as South Africans, though.
Well, it's much more a question of feeling isolated.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
much more a question of feeling isolated. So having said that, I think the arms embargo, the financial sanctions, and so on played a critical role. But the
Hmm.
most important role was played with what happened outside. For me, what has happened, the genocide in Gaza, and now the move towards genocide, but ethnic cleansing definitely in the West Bank, um, shows that there isn't the same mass popular uprising at the moment.
Hmm.
And therefore, what happens internationally is going to be critical. And
Hmm.
also, you, I hate everything that has happened in Gaza.
Hmm.
But the one only thing that's a glimmer of hope is
Hmm.
that there's a global movement now that is a million times stronger than the anti-apartheid movement ever was.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's millions of young people who have identified themselves with the people of Palestine.
Hmm. Mazen, I wanted to ask you about this analogy. Zaki is talking about international pressure, but he started by saying that the most important part was the popular uprising from within. Um, and you also, what do you how successful do you think that this movement for boycotting and for international pressure can be without an uprising within on the ground as well? And obviously Palestinians don't have a kind of an equivalent to COSATU, right, to the trade unions that were basically able to really threaten the backbone of the South African economy. So I'm curious how you think about that relationship between internal and external in the Palestinian case.
Uh, yes, sorry, I'm closing my video because the line was cutting a little bit. So for bandwidth, I just keep the voice for now. Um,
No worries.
I mean, what is happening basically globally is a sea change, really, in attitude. Uh, and part of it, I would say I credit, as I said earlier, to the BDS movement, this sea change in public opinion, even American public opinion, both within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party, who are realizing that Israel is really leading the bull by the nose with the ring, the American bull into the fights, spending trillions of dollars of our tax money. I say our because I'm also a US citizen. I pay taxes and it goes to support my oppressors. But anyways, I feel that it's important to realize that there is a change. How effective it is, I mean, nobody knows these things. If you had asked me, as I mentioned, when I was active in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa in the 1980s, if you had asked me in 1985, for example, would I live to see apartheid end in South Africa? I would have said no. I would have said there's generations of problems and so forth, and South Africa collaborating with Israel with nuclear weapons, and Ronald Reagan was in office and was saying he supports South Africa against the communist tide and Africa and all of this stuff. So the things were stacked in a way that would give us a very negative attitude about what is possible and not possible in that circumstance. And the same here. I mean, if you look at objectively, I would say I'm not sure, what is going to happen. I am not certain even that we have a path that is clear towards liberation. And in fact, the other day, they asked me in a talk about what's going to happen. I said there's two pathways. One, we either have freedom and equality, and we end Zionist colonization in Palestine, or we have a world war, and the only winners in those world war will be cockroaches because they are resistant to radiation. And that probability of that second option is about 70%. As looking at all the variables, we are very close to that. Already regional wars are starting, and already the US is picking a fight with countries like Venezuela and China and others in the South China Sea and so forth. All, by the way, egged on by Israel because it makes money off of weapons, and its economy is dependent on continued instability around the world. That's why they support the war on the Sudan and the genocide that's happening in the Sudan. A lot of the weapons come via Israel, funded by the United Arab Emirates and egged on by the US in Sudan. So this is going to lead to a global war, and these are the two options. It's not there's no option where Zionism wins, so to speak, or for that matter, Palestinian Islamists win or anything like that. So we either have human rights and equality and justice, or we have a war that is devastating for everybody.
Hmm.
A lose situation or a win-win situation, if you want.
Yeah. Zaki, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned previously that the anti-apartheid movement made white South Africans feel uncomfortable when they went abroad. And one of the things that happened that I think surprised a lot of people was that there was a kind of crack in the white elite. There were business
Right.
elites who started to say, "Oh, we need to talk to the ANC because things are not we can't solve this problem. We can't put this movement down." And then there were even these cracks in the Afrikaner political elite with the rise of de Klerk.
Yeah.
What do you think one can learn from that for the Israel-Palestine case? What was it that made it such that people who had power came from internally inside the political and economic elite said, we need a plan B? And what can we learn from that for what it would take for Israeli leaders to think we need a plan B?
Look, I think first let me make this point. I think Israel is an apartheid state, but the type of apartheid is completely different to what we had in South Africa. And I saw a comment: did Afrikaners consider themselves appointed by God? Yes, they did. But what was different here compared to Israel is white people relied on black labor.
Right.
White people relied on black labor. We were a majority, first and foremost. And on top of that, our labor was indispensable to making the economy work. The economy was necessary, its work was essential because it contributed to mining, minerals, all those sorts of stuff, gold, diamonds, platinum, and so on. So in that sense, the economy was the basis of the negotiated settlement. When it became clear that a settlement was going to happen, it was the Afrikaners, both the Afrikaners and the English capitalists realized, and the English were a lot worse than the Afrikaners, let me say that to you. What specifically bothered them was the fact that workers were mobilized and organized. That specifically bothered them. Now, in Israel, that's not the situation at the moment. And that's a real weakness. On the other hand, we had pass laws, but the hours in our days were never as policed as the people in the West Bank and in Gaza are. We had a relative autonomy and a relative freedom. There wasn't that type of surveillance. So yes, the break in there was another aspect to it. At that time, you remember the Soviet Union fell.
Yes.
87 was Glasnost, and in 89, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which meant at that point, Thatcher and Reagan believed that neoliberalism was going to conquer the world, and it did. And the socialist parties all died by suicide or self-destruction.
Yes.
And that put all of us in a very difficult position and made internationalism much, much weaker. Because, again, in every country of the world, a socialist party and a communist party would have supported the anti apartheid movement. Today, look at the Labour Party or the Swedish socialists, not to mention Die Linke and every British, the Greens in Germany and so on. I mean, these people are literally apologists or cheer on genocide. So I think what caused the division primarily were two things: labor and the global situation in relation to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Mazen, I mean, from that perspective, it's the Palestinian situation seems much, much harder. I mean, it's not just that Palestinians don't have the labor power that Black South Africans had, but they also, the international situation, as Zaki had alluded to in the past, on the one hand, yes, there's huge upsurge in support for Palestinian freedom, but there's also the rise of a lot of movements around the world, in Europe, the United States, in India, that kind of want to model their countries after Israel, right? As kind of high-tech ethno states. Um, um, so I'm curious how you would reflect on the differences that Zaki has outlined between the South African and the Palestinian situation.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Every colonial situation is different than the other. There are peculiarities and unique features. In South Africa, as mentioned by Zaki, they needed the labor, so it was not total displacement kind of settler colonialism. Here, it's a total displacement, genocidal settler colonialism. Certainly, in our case, it's closer to the situation that developed over the past few hundred years in Australia and in the United States, and it is to South Africa or Algeria, for example. Some people like to cite Algeria. No, I'm sorry. The French never really wanted to get rid of the Algerians. They wanted to just come and settle the country and call it Southern Province of France, etc. So there's peculiarities in each situation. And the peculiarities in the international support issues certainly exist. And I used to actually idolize what happened in South Africa for many years after 1980s when I became involved. I didn't get a chance to go to South Africa until 20 years later in 2008 and so forth. And when I went to South Africa the first time and the second time, to be honest, I was very disappointed. I don't want our outcome here in Palestine to be similar to South Africa in many aspects because there's still economic apartheid in South Africa. And there is, the whites were left to keep all the loot they got, all the land, all the resources, all the gold mines, etc., are still in the hands of the whites. And they managed to get a few corrupt black people to be in power, like the previous president, I forget his name now, who had like 36 sons or something, and was very rich and had developed these agreements with Britain to get weapons and so forth that South
Jacob
Africa.
Zuma, right?
Zuma, yeah. So there is issues there that I don't want to replicate, certainly. And as I said, I modified my views about what Nelson Mandela did after visiting South Africa and seeing that the whites were allowed even to keep their educational system with its racist contents and even keep their museums with their racist content. So this to me was too much of a compromise. I think if we are going to move forward, I mean, it still is important because what happened is it opened the way for democratic transitions, and decolonization is not an on-off switch. It's a long process of decolonization. We see this in many countries. We have to remember that just about every country on earth had decolonization or had colonization before. And some of them are well better on their way than others. For example, Mexico and Brazil are very different in their stage of decolonization. In Brazil, there are still people like Bolsonaro who want to bulldoze the Amazon and put cow farms there and kill off the indigenous people. And in Mexico, you know, the Aztec and the Spaniards are intermarried to a point where I can't tell who's who. So things move in different paces or different stages, depending on the country you're talking about. And certainly in our country, we have begun the process. By the way, I don't want, you know, this is where you may be surprised at what I say next. I think Zionism already lost. I think the only thing that keeps Zionists like Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and those guys, Bennett and so forth, in power is just military support and military might with the US and Western support, and the Israeli pro-Zionist lobbies in Washington, which Zaki also pointed out that there was no big pro-apartheid lobbies that are working to ensure that South African apartheid remains in power. So I think we have more challenges, yes, but we also have better opportunities. For example, in 1980s, we didn't have what's called the internet and social media and all of this stuff. Now we do, and things are rapidly evolving, and the world is changing much more rapidly from a unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union to a multipolar world with BRICS and other countries. And so I think Zionism is either finished or it's doomed to be finished soon. We just need to accelerate its hopefully peaceful demise via boycott, divestment, sanctions, and other strategies that we adopt.
Hmm. I think we're just about out of time. Zaki and Mazen, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
I will also
Very good.
put my email in the chat if people want to email me and stay in touch. You would be welcome. And I put also in the email a couple of links in the chat, a couple of links that might be useful, including about the discriminatory law database that Adala did.
Thank you very
Just
much.
one,
I see
just
that.
one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
Watch two movies. One
Yeah.
is called A Bloody Miracle,
Okay.
which would temper some of Mazen's comments on the settlement, the negotiated settlement. And the
Okay.
other one is Mandela's Walk to Freedom, which is not really about Mandela, but it's about what happened
Right.
in order to ensure that there wasn't a racial civil war in our country.
Okay. Two movies that A Bloody Miracle and the Walk to Freedom.
Yeah.
Great suggestions from both of you. Zaki, Mazen, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
I hope
you.
everyone has a good
for
week.
doing this. Bless you all.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.